The Reconstruction Era was supposed to heal America's wounds after the Civil War, but it failed so badly that the racial and socioeconomic implications are still being wrestled with in America over 150 years later. War rarely fixes anything. It certainly didn't fix much of the American people after the Civil War ended in 1865, and the Reconstruction Era immediately after the war was arguably a failure. Instead of bringing everyone back together and promoting liberty and justice for all, things that would have been difficult to do due to the political climate and racial tensions, the Reconstruction Era ended with social divides, economic imbalances, and racism so ingrained in the system that hate groups determined who could vote in some towns. But where did the Reconstruction Era go wrong? It started out with the best of intentions. The Civil War had been hard for everyone. The country had been torn in half over slavery, states' rights, and westward expansion, and the country lost around 620,000 men, with a total of about 1.5 million casualties, killed, wounded, captured, and missing throughout the war. When the North finally won, the strain of the war had built resentment on both sides. The North believed they were morally superior and blamed the South for the loss of life and the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The South blamed the North for ruining their economy and destroying their farms and cities, which meant there was widespread hunger and homelessness. The South was bitter, and although Reconstruction tried to mend the gap, it only made the bitterness worse, and it still lingers in American culture today. Of course, Reconstruction might have been more successful if Abraham Lincoln had actually implemented it. His vision to bring the country back together started with his Emancipation Proclamation, which was a proclamation that he, the President of the Union, made to free all slaves living in the Confederacy. This meant that any Southern slave who crossed into Northern territory was forever free. The second part of his plan was called the 10% Plan. It stated that after the war, any Confederate state would be accepted back into the Union if 10% of the eligible voters agreed to it. There would be no legal action, no property confiscation, and no punishment. The newly returned states could have their state governments back and could rebuild themselves, and all they would have to do was implement the new laws regarding freeing their slaves. In the light of the war, the South could have easily accepted this plan. But some of their politicians in Congress thought this plan was too easy. As Northerners, they had seen the damage the war had done to the Union, and they wanted to punish the South. These politicians split the Republican Party in half. The moderates wanted to reunite the Union at any cost, and the radical Republicans wanted to end slavery and all its implications at any cost. They passed the Wade-Davis Bill, which included requiring half of the voters of each state to take a loyalty oath before rejoining the Union and make voting contingent on a personal loyalty oath to the government. The bill was harsh, and Lincoln refused to sign it, preventing it from coming into effect. But the demands for more action were already in place, and the radical Republicans turned their attention to creating a new amendment to the Constitution. This would eventually become the 13th Amendment, and it made slavery illegal, unless it was used as punishment for a crime, and empowered the national government to make any laws necessary and appropriate for supporting this new amendment. The amendment was eventually passed by Congress and ratified by 3/4 of the states. And although it certainly freed the African Americans from slavery, it created other problems. The newly freed slaves had no place to live, no money to support themselves, and no protection under the law. Many found themselves working the same land as before. The fight for civil rights would be an uphill battle. After President Lincoln was assassinated in 1865, the Reconstruction efforts fell to President Andrew Johnson. He believed very strongly in states' rights and thought the Southern states could control their own Reconstruction efforts. Although Johnson did push for every Southern state to ratify the 13th Amendment as part of the presidential Reconstruction, he had to sell it to them, which means that the white supremacists in office legislated and enforced much of the Reconstruction laws. They could determine who had the right to vote, and they demanded that the freed slaves return any federally granted land to the previous owners. Although the National Congress fought President Johnson every step, he continued his laissez-faire attitude, so most national Reconstruction policies were passed regardless of Johnson's veto. The radical Republicans were furious when they realized what the president had done. They thought his Reconstruction efforts were much too lenient and did not protect the newly freed peoples. They saw that many southern states were starting to pass black codes, which were laws that legalized racism and segregation. The laws were intended to criminalize African Americans and force them to continue working in the same positions as before. Some northern states saw this and began to pass black codes of their own, so African Americans could be arrested and forced to work for being unemployed, being vagrant, or even trying to vote. The radical Republicans decided they had to do something about this, so they pushed back against the black codes with the Civil Rights Act of 1866. This law said that every citizen was equal under the law, and it defined citizenship as anyone born in the United States regardless of race, except for Native Americans, but that's another story. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 was intended to give the freed slaves protection under the law, but it did not give them the right to vote, and discrimination continued regardless of the new law. In 1866, the radical Republicans won enough seats in Congress that they were able to start their own Reconstruction phase, which is called radical or congressional Reconstruction. The first thing they did was pass the first Reconstruction Act of 1867, which made universal male suffrage, regardless of race, a requirement for rejoining the Union. Southern states had to rewrite their constitutions to include the 13th and 14th Amendments, and they were furious that they had to start over after the presidential Reconstruction. For a short time, there was interracial democracy. Around 2,000 African Americans held public offices, including in the South. The 13th Amendment got rid of slavery, and the 14th Amendment made sure citizenship extended to the freed slaves, which meant that they were to have all the rights and privileges of citizens, including protection from discriminatory laws. During radical Reconstruction, the Republicans had control of the southern state governments, and they tried to establish their beliefs in equality between the races. The Southern Democrats hated the Caucasian men who sided with the African Americans, directing as much hate against the carpetbaggers and scalawags as against the freed slaves. The radical Republicans had more work to do, though, to complete their radical Reconstruction, and their next move was to take out President Johnson. He believed that Republicans were being too harsh and creating animosity in the nation he was trying to reunite, so he vetoed almost every bill the Republican Congress created. Of course, the Republicans had the votes to override his vetoes, but they began to hate him for standing in their way. In 1867, they passed the Tenure of Office Act. Although they stated it was to prevent him from dismissing old Republican cabinet members without cause, it was secretly also to trap Johnson in a bad situation. When Johnson tried to dismiss Edward Stanton, the Secretary of War under Lincoln's term, the Republicans quickly moved to impeach him. The House voted to impeach, but the Senate acquitted him by one vote. Although President Johnson was not successfully removed from office, the impeachment trial diminished his power and popularity, effectively ending his term and paving the way for President Ulysses S. Grant to be voted president in 1868. The next move for the radical Republicans was the 15th Amendment, which stated that all citizens, regardless of race, had the right to vote. The amendment was controversial. To get it approved, they had to remove the most controversial parts, which upset most of the radical Republicans. Still, most Republicans believed that they had finally achieved their purpose. They had legalized voting rights for freed slaves. Now that they could vote, the races could be equal under the law, and the country would enjoy interracial democracy without significant resistance. So why didn't that happen? If the Republicans passed all the legislation they thought they needed, why have civil rights and systemic racism continued to affect the United States today? Well, they may have changed and added some laws, but they had not addressed the cultural or philosophical issues behind systemic racism, which is much harder to do. By 1870, all of the Confederate states were back in the Union, and the Democrats had retaken control of the state governments. The conservative Southerners used their power to highly discourage African Americans from voting by instituting poll taxes and using a variety of intimidation techniques, which included the terror tactics of the Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan had started as a fraternity in 1865, but it did not stay that way for very long. It quickly became a violent terror group set on undoing radical Reconstruction. They intimidated African Americans to keep them from voting by destroying property, attacking people, and even murdering victims. Congress tried to stop the Ku Klux Klan by passing enforcement acts that continued to assert the rights of African Americans. And although the KKK faded, it did not disappear entirely. It would go through stages of lying dormant and then reviving itself again. In fact, the KKK still has a few members in the United States today. The radical Republicans continued to push, especially as the southern states returned more and more to their practices before Reconstruction had even begun. They passed the Civil Rights Act of 1875 to give African Americans equal access to public transportation and allow them to serve on juries. And it said that all cases involving civil rights had to be heard on the federal level. This was the last major piece of legislation passed during Reconstruction, and much of the act was deemed unconstitutional before it could truly go into effect. The remaining parts asserted that all should have equal access to public accommodations, which was interpreted to allow for private discrimination to continue. By 1877, Reconstruction was basically over. The South continued to fight against it by any means necessary, and the North had lost interest in favor of the Gilded Age and new business ventures. They had been fighting an economic depression since 1873, and saving the economy seemed more pressing to the Northerners than protecting the freed slaves. The Republicans had grown less radical, and the Democrats had begun asserting their interests again, which pulled attention away from the drifting Reconstruction initiatives. The 1876 presidential election was messy. 4 of the states had voter fraud, and at least 11 people died in fights over it. The Republicans and Democrats got together to talk about it all, and they drafted the Compromise of 1877. In order to allow Rutherford B. Hayes to win the election, the Democrats wanted a few things, including boosting the Southern economy and the provisions that the national government would not interfere with the race issues in the South. The compromise was signed, and Reconstruction was officially over. Once the Southerners were left to their own devices, they immediately began to pass Jim Crow laws, which allowed for incarceration and the intimidation of African Americans to keep them from voting. It also made segregation legal, and even though the facilities were supposed to be separate but equal, according to Plessy versus Ferguson, they were not even close. Reconstruction had been intended to bring the nation back together and ensure the equal rights of the freed slaves to participate as citizens. However, it was a failure. There was so much political infighting that in the end, Reconstruction left the African Americans in much the same situation it had found them in: poor, hungry, and determined to be free. To learn more about the Reconstruction Era, check out our book, The Reconstruction Era, a captivating guide to a period in the history of the United States of America that greatly impacted American civil rights after the War for Southern Independence. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Also, grab your free Mythology Bundle ebook while it's still available. All links are in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.